On April 14, 1943, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, Pearl Harbor. The steady hum of radios and the sharp scratch of pencils filled the dimly lit cryptography room. The team worked in almost complete silence, their minds focused on deciphering the complex code that could change the course of the war. It was late in the evening, but there was no time for rest. The pressure to extract critical intelligence was relentless. In the heart of the room, Technical Sergeant Harold Fudina, a meticulous NISI translator with the Military Intelligence Service, carefully transcribed a series of intercepted Japanese naval characters. These characters, seemingly random symbols, were part of a larger message, one that had been sent from the Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet. The deciphering of this message could be a turning point for the Pacific War. The message was precise, almost too precise. As Fudina checked his translation against the original cipher, he marveled at the level of detail it contained. The Japanese military's obsession with order and exactness had created a transmission that left nothing to chance. Dates, times, locations, their meticulous planning was laid bare in every line. This wasn't just a general dispatch, this was an itinerary. A detailed inspection tour schedule for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was embedded in the text. The message revealed everything: the exact time of departure from Rabaul, the arrival time at Balil Airfield, the aircraft types to be used, the escort details, everything. This wasn't just a routine travel plan. It was the key to striking at one of Japan's most influential leaders. The time was 0600 hours, Tokyo time, and Yamamoto's convoy was set to depart. The exact location, Rabaul, New Guinea. His flight would be escorted by 60 Japanese fighter aircraft, a formidable defense against any potential attack. To the trained eyes of the cryptographers in the room, it was clear. The most significant figure in Japan's naval leadership would soon be within striking distance of American fighters. As Fudina's pencil moved across the paper, carefully translating the final segments of the message, the weight of its contents began to settle over the room. This wasn't just any intercepted communication. This was a blueprint for a high-risk mission, one that, if executed correctly, could change the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. The decoded intelligence was passed along with rapid precision to Commander William Goggins, who was directing operations for the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific. Within moments, Commander Edwin Leighton, the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer, received the news. The impact of the decoded message was immediate. Yamamoto, the man who had orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor, would soon be within range of American fighters. Leighton, upon reading the message, felt his heart race. The implications were immediate. Yamamoto was not just a military leader. He was a symbol of Japanese naval power. To kill Yamamoto would be to shatter the morale of the entire fleet. His mind raced as he considered the enormity of the situation. Could they act on this intelligence? Could they really target the man who had ignited the war in the Pacific? What none of them knew at the time was that this single decoded message would set in motion the most audacious fighter interception in aviation history. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was not just a military commander. He was the embodiment of Japanese naval might. A man of intellect, experience, and deep understanding of America, Yamamoto's influence stretched far beyond the confines of his office in Tokyo. He had been a Harvard-educated strategist, and his knowledge of Western industrial capacity had been vast, though largely ignored by those in power. His assessments of Japan's chances against the United States in a prolonged war were famously pessimistic. He understood the magnitude of America's industrial power and political will. His warnings about the risks of attacking the U.S. had fallen on deaf ears, leading to Japan's ultimate plunge into the Pacific conflict. Yet once the war had begun, Yamamoto showed himself to be a man of exceptional tactical brilliance. He had designed and executed the attack on Pearl Harbor with chilling precision, and his victories in the early Pacific campaigns had brought Japan to the cusp of dominance in the region. But his military foresight, his understanding of America, and his reservations about the war had made him a target. Not only did he understand the enemy's capabilities, but he also understood the symbolic power of the American military. Kill the symbol, and you break the spirit of the enemy. By 1943, Japan's war effort was beginning to falter. The Battle of Midway had been a devastating defeat for Japan, one that had turned the tide of the Pacific War in favor of the United States. But despite these setbacks, Yamamoto remained a powerful figure in the Japanese military hierarchy. His influence remained undiminished, and he continued to inspire loyalty among his men. To kill him would be to strike at the heart of Japan's strategic planning. Yamamoto, despite being at the height of his career, had a certain vulnerability. At 59, he was considered a man of the past, yet his mind remained sharp, his resolve unshaken. He was a paradox in many ways, highly educated, but also deeply traditional. A descendant of samurai, Yamamoto carried with him the weight of Japanese military honor, and that honor was embedded in the very core of his being. His right hand bore the scars of shrapnel from the Battle of Tsushima Strait, a brutal reminder of his resilience and his lifelong commitment to Japan's military heritage. Yet for all his legacy, his decisions often bordered on fatalism. One of his most quoted lines was his infamous admission that Japan could only run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, before the inevitable defeat would come. Yamamoto knew that the war with America was unsustainable, but he was willing to see it through. He was a man who believed deeply in his duty and his people, but also a man who harbored a chilling realism about the war he had led Japan into. For the Americans, however, Yamamoto represented the ultimate prize, a target of symbolic importance as much as military. The architect of Pearl Harbor was now about to embark on a journey that would take him across the Pacific, through skies that had already been tested by the rising strength of American fighters. This was no ordinary reconnaissance mission. This was an inspection tour, and Yamamoto was unaware that the intelligence had already been compromised. The intercepted message outlining his itinerary had provided the Americans with an incredible opportunity, a precise window of vulnerability. Yamamoto's routine flight, usually well protected by fighters, now seemed like a fateful chance, the kind of opportunity that might only come once in a lifetime. But the mission would require extraordinary precision, skill, and luck. As the mission to eliminate Admiral Yamamoto took shape, one element stood out as the key to its success: the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. This remarkable aircraft, often overshadowed by its more famous counterparts like the P-51 Mustang, would prove to be the true hero of the mission. With its distinctive twin-boom design and twin engines, the P-38 was unlike any other fighter in the American arsenal. The P-38's design was a marvel of engineering. Equipped with twin Allison V1710 engines, it could reach speeds of over 400 mph, making it a formidable opponent at higher altitudes. But it wasn't just speed that made the P-38 exceptional, it was its range. With two 165-gallon drop tanks, the aircraft could achieve a combat radius of over 450 miles, more than sufficient to cover the 600-mile journey to intercept Yamamoto's flight. No other American fighter in the Pacific theater could match this range. While other fighters might have been limited by fuel or speed, the P-38 offered the unique combination of long-range endurance, firepower, and maneuverability that would prove indispensable. With four 0.5 caliber Browning M2 machine guns and a 20mm Hispano cannon, it had a firepower profile that could inflict significant damage to enemy bombers, something that many of the lighter American fighters lacked. But the P-38's design was not just about firepower and speed. It was built to withstand the rigors of the Pacific, designed to function as a long-range escort fighter. The aircraft's twin engines offered redundancy, ensuring that even if one engine failed, the other could bring the plane home. This reliability proved critical during the mission, as many of the pilots would push their aircraft beyond normal limits, relying on the P-38's toughness to make it through the grueling operation. For Major John Mitchell, the man tasked with leading the mission, the P-38 was more than just a weapon, it was his partner. With over 2,000 flight hours under his belt, Mitchell had the experience necessary to tackle the complex navigation and combat challenges of the mission. He had flown everything from basic trainers to the most advanced fighters in the American arsenal, and his understanding of aerial tactics made him an ideal choice for the operation. But the P-38's range came at a cost. The aircraft's fuel capacity was limited, and with the distance they had to cover, the margin for error was razor-thin. The pilots would have to carefully manage their fuel and maintain precise navigation to ensure they reached their target and made it home. Every minute, every gallon of fuel, and every maneuver counted. There was no room for mistakes. In addition to the P-38, the mission would also rely on other aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi G4M1 Betty bombers that would carry Yamamoto. The Betty bomber, while not as fast as the P-38, was equipped with a range that could cover the distances necessary for the inspection tour. But despite its range, the Betty bomber was vulnerable. Lightly armored with minimal defensive weapons, it was a sitting duck for any fighter that could close the gap. The P-38, with its incredible speed and firepower, was the perfect counter. But perhaps the greatest challenge in this operation wasn't the aircraft themselves, it was the human element. The pilots, each hand-picked for their skill, would need to perform under extraordinary pressure. They had to manage fatigue, combat stress, and the unforgiving nature of the Pacific weather. The odds were stacked against them from the very beginning, but with the P-38 Lightning as their partner, the pilots had a fighting chance. As Major Mitchell sat in the operations dugout, finalizing the flight plan, the weight of the mission began to sink in. He was leading 18 aircraft on a journey that could end in failure, or, if they succeeded, would strike a devastating blow to the Japanese Navy. The P-38 had proven its worth in combat, but this mission, Operation Vengeance, would test the aircraft's true capabilities like never before. The stage was set. The P-38 Lightnings were fueled and ready, the pilots prepared for the most audacious interception in aviation history. In the early hours of April 18, 1943, the 18 pilots under Major Mitchell's command lined up at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Their task was clear, their objective singular: intercept and eliminate Admiral Yamamoto and his staff, the leaders of the Japanese Pacific Fleet, at the height of their vulnerability. As Mitchell's team revved their engines, the atmosphere at Henderson Field was thick with tension. The mission's success relied not just on the P-38's performance, but also on impeccable timing, coordination, and human skill. Every detail, from the flight path to the fuel consumption rates, had been calculated to the last fraction of a minute. The weather, as predicted, would provide a small window of opportunity, a gap in the cloud cover that could allow them to reach their target, deliver the attack, and return without detection. Mitchell's mind was sharp, focused, calculating. Every calculation mattered. The pilots had to be on schedule down to the minute, and any small deviation in their course could result in failure. They had to close a 600-mile distance across the open ocean, flying at extremely low altitudes to avoid radar detection. In combat, even the smallest misstep could mean the difference between life and death. The pilots began their takeoff sequence at 7:25 hours. The aircraft lifted off one by one, beginning with Mitchell at the front, followed by the rest of his team. Lieutenant Rex Barber, one of the key players in the mission, took his place in the second wave of planes. He had flown countless missions, but this one felt different. The stakes were higher, and there was no room for error. His thoughts were steady, his mind calm, focused on the task ahead. Despite their training and preparation, things began to go wrong almost immediately. Lieutenant James M. Lanahan's aircraft suffered a blown tire during takeoff, forcing him to skid off the runway. He was unhurt, but his plane was out of commission, and Lieutenant Joe Moore was forced to return to base shortly after departure due to a malfunction in his fuel transfer system. As the remaining 16 planes formed up and headed toward the open ocean, the challenges of navigation, weather, and fatigue began to set in. Flying at extremely low altitudes, the pilots battled constant fatigue, unrelenting monotony, and the harsh reality of fatigue in the unrelenting, sun-scorched heat. The aircraft low to the ocean were constantly buffeted by wind and salt spray that coated the windshields, forcing the pilots to continuously wipe them clear. The sensation of flying over endless blue ocean was both hypnotic and terrifying, knowing that any mistake in navigation could leave them lost and stranded in hostile waters. The team flew in radio silence, relying solely on visual signals to maintain their formation. Mitchell kept the formation low, just enough to avoid radar detection, yet high enough to avoid crashing into the ocean's waves. The low altitude also meant that they couldn't rely on normal navigation beacons. They were dependent on their instruments and calculations alone. Every mile was meticulously measured. As the pilots pushed through the fatigue of the long flight, there was no room for error. Mitchell's team reached the midpoint of their flight without incident, but despite their careful calculations, Lieutenant Ames began to notice troubling signs. His fuel consumption was higher than expected. Drop tanks meant to extend their range had more drag than anticipated, leaving him with only 5 minutes of reserve fuel. That meant he had no room for error if they were to reach the target, let alone return home. As the hours passed, the tension mounted. The pilots were mentally exhausted but had to remain sharp. This wasn't just a mission, it was a decisive moment in the Pacific War. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had become the symbol of the Japanese threat in the Pacific. Eliminating him wouldn't just strike at the heart of Japan's naval strategy, it would have psychological consequences far beyond the battlefield. At 9:34 hours, the moment they had trained for arrived, Mitchell's sharp eyes spotted the target, a formation of 2 Betty bombers with 6-0 fighters providing escort. It was a perfect setup. The Japanese escorts were unaware of the American attack, and the Americans had surprised them from below, catching the enemy off guard. The timing was incredible. The formation of 16 P-38s was in the perfect position to strike. Mitchell immediately ordered the drop tanks to be jettisoned, clearing the aircraft of unnecessary weight and allowing the fighters to achieve their maximum speed. The P-38s began to accelerate toward the bombers, diving toward their target at high speed. But the Zeros were quick to respond. As soon as they spotted the American fighters, they shed their own belly tanks and began to peel off to intercept. Captain Lanier, one of the key pilots in the mission, made an immediate decision. Instead of pursuing the bombers directly, he would engage the Zeros to clear the path for Lieutenant Barber, who was following in his wake. The resulting dogfight was chaotic. The Zeros, known for their maneuverability, were at a significant advantage in the turns, but Lanier, flying the P-38, had the speed advantage. He engaged in a high-energy maneuver, taking advantage of the P-38's superior speed and firepower. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Barber pressed his attack on the lead bomber. At 500 yards, Barber fired a burst of machine gun rounds and 20mm cannon fire at the bomber's right engine. The results were instantaneous. The engine exploded in a brilliant orange fireball, and the wing spar was severed, causing the bomber to roll out of control. Barber avoided a collision, pulling up sharply as the bomber spiraled toward the jungle below, marking the first bomber kill of the mission. But the question remained, which bomber had Admiral Yamamoto been in? As the bombers began their escape maneuvers, the mission's true nature was becoming clear. The pilots had succeeded in eliminating the bombers, but had no way to confirm whether Yamamoto was among the casualties. It wasn't just about the mission's success. It was about confirming whether the symbolic blow to the Japanese Navy had been delivered. The mission had unfolded like a perfect storm. The P-38 Lightnings had flown their 600-mile trek through the open Pacific with precision and daring. The bombers were gone, their wreckage already plummeting into the jungle below, but the real question now was, had they succeeded in their ultimate goal? Had they eliminated Admiral Yamamoto? As the 16 aircraft of Mitchell's squadron turned back toward Guadalcanal, a tense quiet settled over the pilots. Their adrenaline was still high, their bodies stiff from hours of intense flying, but they knew the next crucial task, survival. With fuel reserves running dangerously low and damaged aircraft limping home, the flight back would test their endurance just as much as the attack had. Lieutenant Rex Barber, who had fired the fatal shots at the lead bomber, surveyed his damaged P-38. 104 bullet holes peppered his aircraft, and one of the engines was sputtering, likely due to debris sucked into the engine during the battle. His hydraulic system was leaking, and he could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. Every second mattered now, every drop of fuel. Barber kept his focus, knowing that all eyes were on him to lead the way back. The constant hum of his Allison engines was joined by the sound of his fellow pilots' engines, each one pushing their aircraft toward home. The return leg of the journey was as critical as the intercept. Despite the mission's success, they still had to make it back to base, to the relative safety of Henderson Field, a few hours away but still a far-off goal. The pilots were exhausted and worn, but they couldn't afford to relax, not yet. The danger wasn't just the Japanese fighters they had evaded. The Pacific Ocean was vast, the distance too great, and the risk of mechanical failure ever present. The pilots were fighting against not just the forces of war, but also the forces of nature. Fuel was running low, and the ever-present threat of falling into the sea hung like a shadow over the flight. Lieutenant Holmes experienced engine trouble that forced him to reduce power, falling behind the rest of the formation. His fate was uncertain. The flight was long and grueling. With every passing minute, the pilots had to calculate their fuel consumption meticulously. The burn rate was higher than anticipated, and every gallon of fuel that drained from the tanks meant one less chance for survival. At one point, Lieutenant Hine had to make a choice: risk landing on the emergency strip at Banaka Island or push forward, trusting his calculations and his aircraft's reliability. The unknown dangers of the island were too great, and he pressed on. As the squadron neared the Russell Islands, the sight of familiar land brought a small sigh of relief. They were close, but even then nothing was certain. There were still critical decisions to be made. For Lieutenant Hine, the choice was clear. He could not risk a crash landing over the ocean with sharks lurking below. He pushed on, knowing that if he ran out of fuel, his chances of survival were slim. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, the pilots caught sight of the hazy outline of Guadalcanal, their home base. Mitchell, who had maintained a calm and steady hand throughout the mission, saw the familiar fighter strip ahead exactly as he had planned. His mind, which had calculated every detail of the outbound leg, now worked to guide the formation home. The distance between them and safety was closing, but the pilots knew they were not out of danger yet. At 12:30 hours local time, they began their final approach to Henderson Field. As the first aircraft touched down, the ground crews rushed to meet them, ready to assess the damage. The pilots, though exhausted and in pain, felt a sense of accomplishment, but there was still the question that gnawed at them: had they killed Yamamoto? They had destroyed both bombers, but in the chaos of the attack, it had been impossible to confirm which aircraft had carried the Admiral. Now, as the planes taxied back to the line, the pilots disembarked and looked around to see if anyone had news. Captain Lanier, who had engaged the escort Zeros, was quick to claim that he had shot down Yamamoto's bomber after a spectacular maneuver. His story, as he would later tell it, was heroic, a solo vertical reversal that brought the bomber down in flames. But this version would soon become controversial. Lieutenant Barber, however, remained quieter. He knew the truth. He had attacked the lead bomber directly, a straightforward assault that had torn the aircraft apart. It was his shot that had likely taken Yamamoto's life, but Barber did not seek glory. He knew the nature of the mission. It was not about personal fame, it was about achieving the mission's goal. He would not claim what wasn't his to claim, and his version of events would prove to be more accurate as history played out. As the pilots debriefed, the atmosphere was filled with uncertainty. They had carried out the mission as planned, and they had succeeded in their task, but the question of Yamamoto's fate hung heavy. Intelligence officers had no immediate answers. It would take days before the Japanese reaction would confirm whether the admiral was dead. The pilots could only wait and hope their mission had been a success. That night, as the sunset turned into darkness, the pilots gathered at the officers' club. Captain Lanier, ever the showman, began promoting his version of events, recounting a heroic tale of maneuvering and shooting down the admiral's bomber. His claims, already inflated, would continue to evolve with time. But as the night went on, the pilots who truly knew what had happened could only reflect on the mission's significance, its outcome far more important than any individual glory. The day after the mission, the atmosphere at Henderson Field was a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The pilots had landed, exhausted and battle-worn, yet there was no time for relief. The dangerous mission they had flown to destroy Admiral Yamamoto was complete, but the ultimate confirmation was still elusive. The question on everyone's mind was, had they succeeded? The wreckage of 2 bombers burned on the jungle floor, but no one knew for sure which one had carried the admiral. They had done their part. Now, the intelligence officers would have to confirm the target. The pilots gathered, still in their flight suits, their faces weary. Captain Lanier, ever the public figure, had already begun spinning his tale, turning the events of the attack into a heroic solo effort. He was convinced he had shot down Yamamoto's bomber, and his claims were not so easily dismissed. His actions during the mission, engaging the Japanese escorts in a tight maneuvering battle, were impressive. But despite his bravado, Lanier could not escape the truth. Confirmation was beyond him. The mission was a team effort, and the question now was which bomber carried the admiral. Lieutenant Barber, who had stayed in the background, was more concerned with the mission's success than any claims to fame. His straightforward attack on the lead bomber had likely resulted in the destruction of Yamamoto's aircraft, but that was not something he could prove. His aircraft had suffered from enemy fire, and the damaged engines were a constant reminder of the close call he had experienced. But the focus wasn't on personal glory, it was on whether they had achieved the mission's ultimate goal. As the pilots went through the routine of debriefing and aircraft inspections, the mood was tense. They had carried out an audacious mission, and now they needed confirmation to understand its significance. Intelligence officers pored over the intercepted radio traffic from the Japanese, trying to piece together the puzzle. They had broken the codes, they had deciphered the message, but now they needed hard evidence that the right target had been hit. At HQ, Commander Edwin Leeton, the Pacific Fleet intelligence officer, worked furiously to gather every piece of information. He had double-checked the decoding of the intercepted message, and now he waited for confirmation from the Japanese reaction. His role in the success of the mission couldn't be understated, but like the rest of the men, he knew that success meant more than just hitting the target. It meant confirming the death of the man who had masterminded Pearl Harbor, the man who had nearly led Japan to ultimate victory in the Pacific. As the hours passed, the pilots had to distract themselves. The officers' club buzzed with stories and half-formed theories, but the question remained unanswered. Some of the pilots exchanged pleasantries about near misses and their aircraft's performance, but there was no escaping the gnawing uncertainty. Then late that afternoon, the first real piece of news arrived. Japanese search parties had discovered one of the downed Betty bombers in the dense jungle of Bougainville. The wreckage was scattered through the underbrush, and the bodies of the crew were found among the debris. The most crucial detail: Admiral Yamamoto's body was among the dead, found outside the aircraft, still strapped in his seat. His white-gloved hand clutched his katana sword, and his body was remarkably dignified, even in death. The confirmation had come. Admiral Yamamoto was dead. The news spread like wildfire through the base. There was no celebration, no sense of victory. It was more somber than anyone had anticipated. The mission had succeeded, but it had come at a high cost. For Lieutenant Barber, the confirmation was bittersweet. He had been the one to attack the lead bomber, and his attack geometry matched perfectly with the bullet holes found in Yamamoto's body. The Japanese records, which were reviewed after the war, confirmed that Barbara's version of events was the most accurate. Despite the claims made by Captain Lanier, it was clear that Barbara was the one who had fired the fatal shots that brought down Yamamoto's plane. But for Barbara, there was no pride in being the man who killed the architect of Pearl Harbor. The mission had been a military necessity, and it had brought an end to a crucial chapter in the war. Yamamoto's death had been a decisive blow to the Japanese Navy's leadership, but it also symbolized the end of any hope for negotiation with Japan. Yamamoto had been the last of the rational voices in the Japanese military. With him gone, there would be no one left to acknowledge the limits of Japan's power or the futility of continuing a war of attrition. Pilots, though fatigued and eager to return home, understood the significance of the mission. They had struck at the heart of the Japanese war effort, and the psychological toll on the enemy would be immense. But the real cost was yet to be fully realized. The Pacific War would drag on for another 2 years, with many more battles to be fought. Yamamoto's absence left a massive void in Japanese naval leadership, and his replacement, Admiral Koga, was no match for his predecessor's strategic foresight. As the pilots reflected on the outcome, they were left with a sobering thought. The price of victory was often far higher than anyone could have anticipated. Yamamoto's death, though strategically significant, had left a moral void for those who had flown the mission. The death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto on April 18, 1943, would have far-reaching consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical success of the American mission. While the pilots who flew the operation felt a mix of relief and exhaustion, the military and strategic ramifications of Yamamoto's death would reverberate across the Pacific for years to come. The psychological blow to the Japanese Navy was immeasurable. Yamamoto had been the embodiment of Japan's naval strength and vision. His intellectual brilliance, paired with his profound understanding of American industrial power, had made him a formidable force in the war. But it was not just his strategic acumen that set him apart. It was his charisma and the loyalty he inspired in those who served under him. To lose such a figure was to lose Japan's best hope for a strategic vision that could have ended the war sooner, or perhaps even tilted it in Japan's favor. In the wake of his death, Japan's naval leadership was thrown into disarray. His successor, Admiral Minoru Koga, was a capable officer but lacked Yamamoto's strategic insight and ability to inspire the same level of respect and loyalty. The Japanese Navy would never recover from the loss of its brightest mind. American intelligence, on the other hand, reaped the rewards of their success. The code-breaking efforts that had led to Operation Vengeance were widely regarded as a turning point in the war. The decoding of Japanese communications, a feat that had been painstakingly carried out by analysts like Lieutenant Commander Edwin Leighton at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, had not only facilitated the mission to kill Yamamoto, but would continue to provide critical advantages throughout the Pacific campaign. The ability to read Japanese messages, broken by American cryptographers, had allowed the U.S. to anticipate enemy movements and strikes with stunning precision. The defeat at Midway, which turned the tide of the war, had been made possible because of similar intelligence successes. And now, with Yamamoto out of the picture, the Japanese Navy was on the back foot, unable to respond to the American offensives with the same coordination and efficiency that had characterized its early successes. For the pilots involved in the mission, the war was far from over. Their actions, though celebrated and recognized within military circles, would soon be overshadowed by the complexities of post-war politics and the controversies surrounding the mission's aftermath. Captain Lanier, whose public narrative of the mission had quickly become inflated and widely known, would continue to promote his role in Yamamoto's kill, despite mounting evidence that Lieutenant Barber had been the one to deliver the fatal shots. The dispute between the two pilots would continue for decades, poisoning any hopes of personal reconciliation. The legacy of Operation Vengeance was marred not only by the disagreement over who had been responsible for Yamamoto's death, but also by the strategic decisions that followed. Some of the pilots involved would find themselves celebrated as heroes, while others would return to obscurity. Lieutenant Barber, who had quietly taken responsibility for his part in the attack, would find his role in the mission officially recognized only in later years, when the evidence and historical accounts cleared up the confusion. Despite the personal controversies, one thing was indisputable: Operation Vengeance was a resounding success in military terms. But the psychological impact of Yamamoto's loss was more profound than anyone had anticipated. Japan's resolve, once bolstered by the leadership of a strategist like Yamamoto, began to falter. The myth of the invincibility of the Japanese Navy began to crack, and with each subsequent defeat, morale in the Japanese military would continue to deteriorate. It was no longer a war of inevitable victory, it had become a battle for survival. Admiral Yamamoto's death also marked a symbolic turning point. The United States had proven that no leader was beyond reach, and in the eyes of many, this was a clear message to the Japanese military. The era of strategic assassination had begun, and it would only escalate as the Pacific War progressed. Leadership, once thought to be untouchable, was now vulnerable, and that realization began to shape the tactical decisions of both sides. The psychological warfare aspect of the mission was perhaps the most significant. Yamamoto had been a symbol for Japan, someone whose very name evoked the spirit of the Imperial Navy. To eliminate him in such a precise and targeted manner sent a message not only to Japan but to the world. America could strike anywhere, at any time. The ripple effect of Yamamoto's assassination was felt in other theaters of the war. With the Japanese leadership in disarray, the U.S. was able to press its advantage in the Solomons, the Marianas, and beyond. The strategic situation in the Pacific began to shift decisively in favor of the Allies, and Japan's loss of its most skilled military strategist contributed directly to its eventual defeat. However, the moral complexities of the mission lingered for those involved. For some pilots, there was no question that Yamamoto's death was a necessary step in bringing the war to an end. But others, like Lieutenant Leighton, who had known Yamamoto personally during pre-war diplomatic functions, couldn't help but feel the weight of the personal cost. Yamamoto had been a brilliant military mind, but he had also orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attack, a catastrophic blow that had drawn the United States into the war. The decision to assassinate him had been ruthless, but it had been made with the understanding that it was a matter of national survival. The psychological toll on the pilots was also significant. Many of them, like Lieutenant Barber, never sought glory. They flew their mission with the understanding that it was not about personal fame, but about serving a greater purpose. Yet after the mission, the publicity that surrounded it became almost unbearable. The public and the military were eager to turn the event into a symbol of retribution, but the pilots were reluctant to embrace that narrative. They had done their job, but the notion of personal revenge never felt entirely right. As the war progressed, the broader implications of Yamamoto's death became more and more apparent. His absence left a massive hole in Japan's strategic direction, and without his voice, the Japanese Navy began to lose its cohesion. The cultural mythology surrounding him, once seen as unshakable, began to unravel. The moral and psychological ramifications of targeting a leader in such a calculated and cold-blooded way were felt by those who had carried out the mission and by those who would later analyze it. Following the death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the immediate aftermath was marked by a wave of emotions among the American pilots, military officials, and the broader public. Operation Vengeance, as it came to be known, had achieved its objective, but with success came significant controversy, particularly around the question of credit for the mission's success. The pilots who flew the mission, especially Lieutenant Rex Theodore Barber and Captain Thomas Lanier, found themselves at the center of a dispute that would divide opinions for years to come. Captain Lanier, eager to capitalize on his newfound notoriety, was quick to claim the glory for himself. He promoted a version of events that placed him at the forefront of the attack, asserting that he had been the one to deliver the fatal blow to Yamamoto's bomber. Lanier's version of the story, often described as a spectacular aerial maneuver, was far more dramatic than the actual events. His tale included a vertical reversal, where he allegedly swooped in from above and shot down the bomber. However, this account would later be disputed by evidence, and many would argue that Lanier's actions were motivated by self-promotion rather than a commitment to the mission. Lieutenant Barber, in contrast, remained more reticent about his role, though he had been the one who ultimately fired the shots that downed the bomber carrying Yamamoto. His version of the events was simpler and consistent with the evidence. He had pursued the lead bomber, executing a straightforward stern chase and delivering a decisive attack. Barber's account matched the physical evidence, including the angle of bullet impacts on Yamamoto's body and the trajectory of the missiles that hit the bomber. Despite this, his quieter demeanor meant that he was overshadowed by Lanier's public relations campaign. The debate over who was responsible for Yamamoto's death would ripple through the military and public consciousness. Time magazine even featured Captain Lanier in an article about the mission, further fueling the controversy. Barber had not sought publicity, but he couldn't ignore the growing false narrative that was being pushed by his fellow pilot. The issue would not be fully settled for decades. In 1991, the Air Force officially credited both Barber and Lanier with half a kill each, a compromise that satisfied no one. It wasn't until 2003, after the release of Japanese records and careful analysis of the crash site, that historians concluded that Barber alone was responsible for shooting down Yamamoto's aircraft. The controversy surrounding the mission did not end with the pilot dispute. The larger political and military repercussions of Yamamoto's death were felt across the Pacific War. Yamamoto's strategic vision, which had once guided Japan, was gone. His successor, Admiral Minoru Koga, was less capable and less strategic, lacking the charisma and leadership that Yamamoto had provided. The Japanese Navy, once the pride of Japan, began to experience a deterioration in morale and effectiveness. Yamamoto's absence left a vacuum that his successors struggled to fill, and Japan's naval operations became more disjointed and desperate as the war progressed. From an American perspective, the successful assassination of Yamamoto marked a critical psychological victory. The United States had struck a blow not only against Japan's military leadership, but also against the very mythology of Japan's military invincibility. Yamamoto had been portrayed as a commander who could not be touched, and to eliminate him so surgically sent a clear message to both Japan and the rest of the world. The United States could strike at any target, regardless of the enemy's perceived strength. The element of surprise was vital to the mission's success, and it was a demonstration of America's superior intelligence capabilities, specifically the work done by cryptographers at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific. However, the American reaction to the mission was not without its complications. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, while pleased with the success, remained cautious. He understood the strategic importance of maintaining the secrecy of American cryptography. Revealing that the U.S. had broken Japanese codes could force the Japanese to change their encryption methods, which would, in turn, jeopardize the intelligence advantage that had proved decisive in key battles like Midway. Consequently, the news of Yamamoto's death was kept under wraps for weeks, and only after Japan announced the loss of their admiral on May 21, 1943, was the truth about the operation made public. The delay in announcing the mission's success caused some frustration among the American pilots who had participated in the operation. They had risked their lives in what they knew was a critical mission, yet the political and military decision-makers were reluctant to acknowledge their accomplishment too openly. The publicity surrounding Operation Vengeance and the questions of credit became a point of tension for many of the veterans involved. They had completed a highly dangerous mission, but the truth of their involvement was only recognized much later, after much debate and controversy. As the war continued, the impact of Yamamoto's death was felt not just in Japan's naval operations, but also in the broader strategic environment. The United States now recognized the value of precision strikes and targeted operations against enemy leaders. It was a model of warfare that would influence tactics throughout the Pacific War and beyond. The concept of strategic assassination would become more prevalent as the U.S. sought to disrupt the leadership of its adversaries, whether through aerial strikes or other forms of covert action. The moral dilemmas surrounding such tactics would remain a topic of discussion for many years. Was it right to kill a high-ranking enemy commander, even one as strategically significant as Yamamoto? For some, the answer was clear. It was a necessary action to protect American lives and weaken Japan's war effort. For others, particularly those who had known Yamamoto personally, the moral complexity was difficult to ignore. Yamamoto had been a military genius, but he had also orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor, and his death had been a military necessity. The success of Operation Vengeance on April 18, 1943, reverberated across both the American and Japanese forces, signaling a pivotal shift in the course of the Pacific War. The death of Admiral Yamamoto, Japan's most accomplished naval strategist, shattered the illusion of invincibility that had pervaded Japanese military thinking. His absence would have profound and lasting consequences on the Japanese Navy's operational effectiveness, morale, and overall strategic direction. In the weeks following Yamamoto's assassination, the psychological blow to the Japanese high command was evident. The loss of such a prominent leader, combined with the realization that the United States could strike deep into Japanese territory with surgical precision, sowed seeds of doubt within the Japanese military. The magnitude of the loss extended far beyond the death of an individual. It represented the destruction of the Japanese Navy's vision for its future and the realization that Japan could no longer maintain its aggressive expansion in the Pacific with the same level of confidence. With Yamamoto's death, the Japanese war effort entered a period of strategic decline. His successors, including Admiral Minoru Koga, lacked the same level of military foresight and leadership charisma that had made Yamamoto a singular force within the Imperial Navy. Koga's inability to inspire or provide cohesive direction contributed to a deterioration in Japan's naval capabilities. The Japanese fleet, once formidable and feared, became increasingly disjointed and vulnerable. Meanwhile, American forces, buoyed by the successful execution of Operation Vengeance, began to turn the tide of the Pacific War. The United States military had long been aware of Japan's vulnerabilities, but the decisive action against Yamamoto proved to be a critical moment of psychological warfare. This operation was not merely a tactical success, but also a demonstration of American resolve that no target, no matter how high-ranking, was beyond reach. The message sent by Operation Vengeance was clear. The United States was no longer on the defensive. One of the most significant impacts of Yamamoto's death was on the Japanese naval air strategy. The loss of their architect left a significant void in strategic thinking. Yamamoto had understood the importance of synchronized naval operations, the interplay between the Navy and the Army, and the vital role of air superiority in modern warfare. Without him, Japan's naval operations began to show signs of strategic incoherence, and their earlier successes began to feel like fleeting victories rather than part of a long-term coherent plan. In contrast, the United States military began to apply lessons learned from the attack on Pearl Harbor and its own successes, like Midway, to greater effect. The United States had developed a more coordinated approach to joint operations, with Army Air Forces, Navy, and Marine Corps working in closer synergy than ever before. The success of Operation Vengeance demonstrated that intelligence and inter-service cooperation were becoming increasingly critical components of America's military strategy. Meanwhile, on the ground in the Pacific, the war was intensifying. The Solomon Islands campaign, which had been at a standstill in early 1943, quickly gained momentum as the United States moved closer to the Japanese strongholds. The American forces turned their focus toward capturing key islands and moving closer to Japan's heartland. With Yamamoto's death, the Japanese lost not just a leader, but also the ability to strategize with the same level of sophistication that had previously been their hallmark. While the Japanese military reeled from the loss of their most prominent commander, American forces continued to gain ground in the South Pacific. The capture of Guadalcanal and the ongoing battles in the Solomons marked the beginning of a sustained American offensive against Japan's outer perimeter. The success at Midway, the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the new offensive strategy marked a turning point in the Pacific theater, with Japan increasingly on the defensive. In Europe, Allied forces were also making progress. The D-Day invasion loomed on the horizon, and the liberation of France was beginning to take shape. The coordinated efforts between the U.S. military and British forces would soon tip the balance of power in favor of the Allied forces, but in the Pacific, the war was still far from over, and the stakes were high. However, despite Japan's difficulties, the war continued with a level of fierce intensity that belied the psychological toll of losing their most revered military leader. The Japanese kamikaze tactics became a hallmark of their desperate defense, marking the start of a more desperate phase in the war. As American forces pressed forward, the Japanese sought to fight to the last man, relying more on sacrificial tactics than on strategic planning. For American military commanders, the importance of intelligence and reliable communications was underscored by the success of Operation Vengeance. Cryptographic victories, such as the breaking of Japanese naval codes, became critical to the success of future operations. As more targets were identified and precise attacks became possible, U.S. military capabilities grew, while Japan's ability to adapt dwindled. The American public, still reeling from the loss of Pearl Harbor, began to feel a growing sense of optimism. The victory in the Pacific appeared more achievable than it had just months before. While battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa still lay ahead, and the Pacific War would continue for nearly another 2 years, the tide had definitively turned. Operation Vengeance was not just a military victory, it became a symbol of American ingenuity, determination, and resolve. The precise elimination of Admiral Yamamoto was a testament to the effectiveness of intelligence warfare, strategic planning, and the use of technological superiority in the context of modern warfare. As the war progressed, the ripple effects of this operation would be felt far beyond the immediate Pacific theater, influencing both military doctrine and the morale of both nations involved. The psychological impact of Yamamoto's death on the Japanese military was profound. His loss shattered the myth of Japan's invulnerability and broke the morale of many who had admired him, not only as a military strategist, but as a figurehead of the country's naval prowess. His death symbolized not only the destruction of an individual, but also the collapse of Japan's strategic vision for the future. Without Yamamoto, Japan's leadership struggled to maintain cohesion and direction, contributing to poor strategic decisions in subsequent campaigns. It highlighted the vulnerability of even the most highly placed commanders, showing that American forces could reach out and strike the heart of Japanese military command with precision. For American forces, the mission was a resounding affirmation of the importance of cryptographic intelligence and its application in the theater of war. The success of Operation Vengeance was heavily dependent on decoded Japanese messages, demonstrating how superior code breaking could tip the balance in favor of the United States. The ability to intercept, decode, and act on these messages allowed American forces to anticipate and neutralize high-value targets, including Admiral Yamamoto himself. Furthermore, the technical prowess of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning played a significant role in the success of the mission. The aircraft's range, firepower, and maneuverability were unmatched at the time, making it the perfect tool for a mission that required long-range precision and offensive capabilities. The aircraft's twin-engine design provided additional reliability, ensuring that even damaged planes could return home safely, further underscoring the role of mechanical excellence in ensuring mission success. But perhaps the most important legacy of Operation Vengeance was the demonstration of how coordination and inter-service cooperation could lead to success in modern warfare. The operation required the collaboration of multiple branches of the military, the Navy for intelligence, the Army Air Forces for execution, and the Marine Corps for operational coordination in the Pacific. This successful joint operation demonstrated the power of unified military strategy and set a precedent for future campaigns throughout the war. In the months and years following Operation Vengeance, the United States continued to refine its approach to long-range operations, incorporating the lessons learned from the mission into the development of new tactics and technologies. The P-38 Lightning and its unique capabilities influenced the design and development of future aircraft, particularly the P-51 Mustang, which would become a key asset in the Allied victory over Germany and Japan. The success of Operation Vengeance solidified the P-38's place in aviation history, demonstrating the critical importance of range and firepower in modern air combat. At the same time, the legacy of the operation extended beyond the immediate military impact. The symbolism of the mission was felt on the home front, where the American public saw the operation as a tangible victory after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. The idea that America could strike back at the heart of Japan's military command, using technological ingenuity and precise intelligence, was a boost to national morale. The mission was not only a form of revenge for Pearl Harbor, but also a demonstration that the United States was firmly in control of the war's strategic narrative. However, the aftermath of the operation was not without its controversies. The debate over who was responsible for shooting down Yamamoto became a point of division among the pilots involved. Captain Lanier's claim of glory and his increasingly embellished accounts of his actions stirred resentment among some of the other pilots, particularly Lieutenant Barber, whose more modest and consistent account reflected the actual sequence of events. This dispute would linger for decades, with different accounts circulating, but the historical consensus would eventually favor Barber as the one who fired the fatal shots. In the end, the personal rivalries among the pilots became a secondary issue compared to the military and strategic significance of the mission itself. In Japan, the impact of Yamamoto's death was felt deeply within both the military leadership and the public consciousness. Despite efforts to maintain the illusion that he died in combat, the reality of the operation's precision became evident. Japanese naval authorities quickly recognized the vulnerability exposed by the attack and began to modify their operational strategies accordingly. However, it was too late. Japan's naval operations had already begun to decline in effectiveness, as evidenced by the disastrous outcomes at the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American fighters decimated the remaining Japanese air forces. For the American military, Operation Vengeance was a turning point. It demonstrated the potential of precision airstrikes, not just in decimating enemy forces, but also in disrupting enemy leadership. The success of the mission reinforced the idea that coordinated intelligence and surgical strikes would be essential in future conflicts. The death of Yamamoto was a testament to the ability of American forces to use intelligence, technology, and human ingenuity to overcome the challenges of modern warfare. With Admiral Yamamoto's death on April 18, 1943, the strategic landscape of the Pacific War had been irrevocably altered. The psychological shock felt by the Japanese military reverberated far beyond the immediate tactical loss. Japan's most prominent military strategist had been eliminated, and and in his place stood a leadership structure that lacked his vision and ability to inspire. For the United States, however, the mission had sent a clear message. America could strike decisively, even at the heart of Japan's military command. The resulting momentum in the Pacific became a powerful force that would shape the endgame of the war. Yamamoto's death was not just a loss of one man, but the collapse of an entire strategic framework. He had been the architect of Japan's early successes, including the attack on Pearl Harbor, and was largely responsible for Japan's early naval victories. As one of the few Japanese leaders who truly understood the scale of American industrial power, Yamamoto had foreseen that Japan's war with the United States could not be won in the long term. His realistic assessments had placed him in opposition to other military leaders who sought more aggressive and expansionist tactics. This ideological conflict had placed Yamamoto at the center of both Japan's strategic vision and its internal dissent. With Yamamoto gone, Japan's strategic leadership lost its guiding light. Admiral Minoru Genda, who succeeded him, lacked the same gravitas and strategic insight. Though an experienced aviator and strategist, Genda's leadership could not fill the void left by Yamamoto's death. The subsequent lack of coherent strategy contributed directly to the decline of the Japanese naval forces, as they struggled to maintain control of the Pacific Islands and adapt to the American military's increasing capabilities. Yamamoto's death served as a catalyst for the United States offensive in the Pacific. While the battle for Midway in June 1942 had already marked a pivotal turning point, Yamamoto's elimination further emboldened American forces. The Allied strategy began to focus increasingly on island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified islands, and instead targeting strategically significant islands that would bring American forces closer to Japan itself. The successes achieved by the United States following Operation Vengeance were built on a foundation of improved tactics, technology, and coordination. Long-range bombers, carrier-based aircraft, and new fighter designs such as the P-51 Mustang began to take center stage. The success of Operation Vengeance had demonstrated that even in remote corners of the Pacific, American forces could carry out complex operations with a high degree of precision and effectiveness. As the United States pressed forward, Japan's losses mounted. By mid-1943, the Japanese fleet was significantly weakened, both in terms of available ships and experienced pilots. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, often referred to as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, decimated Japan's remaining naval aviation forces, further confirming the shift in momentum. Yamamoto's death fundamentally altered the psychological and strategic dynamics of the war. For the United States, it marked the beginning of the end for Japan's strategic dominance in the Pacific. The moral victory of killing the architect of Pearl Harbor provided the American military with a sense of justification and purpose. The symbolic importance of Operation Vengeance gave the United States a concrete way to show that revenge for the attack on Pearl Harbor was not only possible but surgical and effective. However, the death of Yamamoto also had profound psychological consequences for the Japanese public. Propaganda had long portrayed Japan's military leadership as invincible, and Yamamoto had embodied this mythos. His sudden death, carried out with such precision, shattered this belief. For Japan's leadership, the implications were stark. If Yamamoto could be killed, what did that say about Japan's strategic security? This realization created a sense of uncertainty and desperation within the Japanese military establishment. Japanese naval operations became increasingly erratic, lacking the steady hand of leadership Yamamoto had provided. By late 1943, the United States had begun to systematically dismantle Japan's strategic infrastructure. The Battle of Tarawa, the Battle of Saipan, and the Battle of the Philippine Sea not only destroyed the bulk of Japan's fleet, but also decimated its remaining aerial capabilities. The increasingly erratic Japanese tactics reflected the lack of clear strategic direction after the loss of their most capable leader. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 marked the final decisive naval engagement of the war, with the Japanese fleet essentially wiped out as an effective fighting force. By then, the United States had already established a strong foothold in the Philippines, and the path to Japan's home islands was now clear. The loss of Yamamoto marked the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire, but the war was far from over. The Japanese military would continue to fight fiercely, employing desperate tactics such as kamikaze attacks and night battles. Yet, without Yamamoto's guiding influence, these efforts lacked the strategic coherence and discipline that had characterized Japan's earlier successes. By 1945, the United States was well positioned to launch an assault on Japan's home islands. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the final chapters of a long struggle that had begun with the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Japan's surrender in August 1945 brought an official end to the Pacific War, but the shadow of Yamamoto's death and the psychological impact of Operation Vengeance would remain a defining moment of the conflict. As the dust settled on the Pacific theater, the full significance of Operation Vengeance and the death of Admiral Yamamoto continued to reverberate. Beyond the tactical victory achieved by the American fighters, there was a deeper, more complex layer to the story. The mission had not only destroyed one of the most capable naval commanders of the era, but also demonstrated the power of coordinated intelligence, technological superiority, and the human factors that shaped wartime success. It was a turning point in both the Pacific War and in how future military operations would be conceived. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was more than just a military commander. He was a strategic visionary. Widely educated and well-traveled, Yamamoto's understanding of global geopolitics and American capabilities set him apart from many of his contemporaries. During his time at Harvard University, where he spent years observing American industrial might and culture, he came to a chilling conclusion: Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. His leadership was characterized by his realism and an ability to understand the bigger picture, which set him at odds with more aggressive, expansionist voices within the Japanese military. Yamamoto's opposition to Japan's war with the United States was driven by a deep understanding of America's industrial capacity. However, once war was thrust upon Japan, Yamamoto became the architect of its initial successes, including the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. Under his leadership, Japan was able to achieve several strategic victories in the early stages of the war, such as the conquest of Southeast Asia and the early naval engagements in the Pacific. However, his belief in the importance of avoiding a war of attrition was gradually overshadowed by Japan's militaristic zeal, which sought to expand its empire beyond sustainable means. The assassination of Yamamoto was a symbolic moment in the Pacific War that went beyond the tactical success of the operation. It showed that American intelligence had gained a foothold so deep within Japanese operations that they could target even the highest-ranking officers with precision. His death demonstrated the potential of intelligence-driven military operations and how such operations could shape the outcome of wars in the modern era. For the American military, the successful interception and elimination of Yamamoto was not only a personal victory, but a strategic blow to the Japanese war effort. His death had immense psychological ramifications within Japan. The idea that the head of the Japanese Navy, a man revered as a symbol of Japan's naval supremacy, could be struck down so precisely in the middle of an ongoing war shattered the myth of invincibility that had surrounded the Japanese leadership. It would take years before the full impact of this psychological blow could be measured, but it was clear that Yamamoto's death had dealt a fatal blow to the cohesion and morale of the Japanese military. The success of Operation Vengeance was not solely about the tactical prowess of the pilots involved. It also reflected the advances in American fighter doctrine. Major John Mitchell, who led the operation, demonstrated an unparalleled understanding of navigation, precision flying, and team coordination. His ability to navigate 600 miles over the Pacific using dead reckoning without the assistance of any radar or GPS underscored the remarkable human skill that guided the P-38 Lightnings to their target. This kind of precision was a direct consequence of the evolution in American aviation and strategic thinking. The P-38 Lightning, which played a central role in the mission, would go on to become one of the most successful and versatile American fighters of the Second World War. The P-38's twin-engine design, long-range capabilities, and devastating nose-mounted firepower were perfectly suited for this interception mission, and its effectiveness would be influential in future fighter designs, such as the P-51 Mustang. These aircraft represented the maturation of American air combat doctrine, one that integrated technological innovation with human skill, a combination that would dominate the skies for the remainder of the conflict. Despite the mission's success, the question of who deserved the credit for Yamamoto's death would spark controversy for years to come. Captain Thomas Lanier, a highly ambitious and vocal pilot, claimed that he had personally shot down the bomber carrying Yamamoto. His account was elaborated over time, growing in complexity and dramatic flair. Lanier's desire for publicity was no secret, and he aggressively promoted his version of the events. In contrast, Lieutenant Rex Barber, who had fired the decisive shots at the lead bomber, remained modest and measured in his account of the mission. Barber's version was straightforward, and the physical evidence, such as the angle of the bullet holes in the wreckage of the bomber, confirmed his account. Despite this, the dispute over who actually shot down Yamamoto would persist for decades, as Lanier continued to build his narrative, while Barber chose to remain silent until much later in life, when historical records vindicated his version. The controversy over the mission's glory created rifts among the participants, with Lanier's push for personal recognition ultimately clouding the full appreciation of the teamwork and precision that had made the mission a success. The narrative of individual glory clashed with the collective achievement of the entire flight, and this division would sour relations among those involved for years to come. In retrospect, Operation Vengeance was not only a symbolic strike against Japan's leadership, but also a critical turning point in how wars were fought. It was a demonstration of how coordinated intelligence, technological innovation, and human skill could combine to achieve an outcome that was previously unthinkable. The operation marked the beginning of a new era in warfare, where precise military operations could be planned and executed with exceptional accuracy. The success of the mission would be echoed in subsequent American operations, where precision airstrikes, intelligence gathering, and long-range fighters would become the hallmarks of American military strategy. The legacy of Operation Vengeance would continue to shape military doctrine and tactics long after the war had ended, and its impact would be felt in conflicts that would unfold throughout the 20th century. The elimination of Yamamoto, while certainly a military victory, was also a testament to the effectiveness of modern warfare. It was the precise integration of technology, intelligence, and human capability that would ultimately define the victory of the Allies in the Pacific.